Namaste. I'm Raghav Krishna. I'm the founder and CEO of Brihat Culture Creatives and Brihat Educational Trust. We focus on the intersection of culture, Indian knowledge systems, and leadership development. And I'm very happy to be talking about the importance, criticality, and in fact, primacy of Ayurveda in the idea of leadership, particularly situating that in the knowledge systems context. I'm very happy that we are having this conversation and a series of discussions around the philosophy, the methods, the knowledge system, and the widespread culture that Ayurveda influences. And today, my approach or where I am located in the conversation is as an outsider in. I'm not an Ayurvedic practitioner. I'm not an Ayurvedic scholar or a Vaidya. My understanding and my tryst with Ayurveda is more as a way of systems thinking for global good. And I'll try and locate the context of our discussion today at three levels. At the level of why a knowledge system like Ayurveda is not just about health of an individual, but it is also about the way of thinking about the world and the interconnected systems. So my first persuasion or my first proposition is that Ayurveda is critical in the global epistemic pool that we can have to solve the interconnected complex challenges that we all face as humanity. The second anchor that I'd like to highlight is Ayurveda as a personal mental model of thinking about yourself, not just because there is really nothing as complex as the human system. And Ayurveda draws from the most complex and minute set of variables to help us understand what integrality really means in a felt way. We can have a theory of integrality. We can talk about the holistic systems. There's a lot of discussion these days about connectivity and interconnectedness and interbeing. But none of that can really work as a thought mode without an actual praxis. So when Ayurveda talks to us about ahar, vichar, vyavahar, it is telling you how to actually make that a lived reality. And I think that's incredibly important because even before we attempt to solve any of the bigger challenges, the entire Indian drishti, the knowledge systems, tells us that our results will be a function of how well we prepare the instrument, your mind, body, energy, spirit. Right? And I feel that Ayurveda is one of those indispensable purchase or indispensable part of our overall leadership makeup for personal potential realization as well. And the third level that I would like to talk about it is in the context of future and where we should locate Ayurveda. So we are also talking about the Amrit Kal now, and we're talking about the vision that we can have for the next 25 years. And I'm here recording this on our Independence Day, and it's an opportunity to wish all the viewers also a very, very happy Independence Day. But real independence, if we were to reflect on this for a minute, is not just about the milestone of which year of independence we are celebrating. It is also about what kind of time are we heralding. And it's very critical because when we talk about Amrit Kal, when we bring in elements of Panchabhutas, of Kala, of Manas, we are actually in the realm of Ayurveda. And this is the beauty and the genius of Indian knowledge systems that I've experienced even in my very, very limited exploration. That regardless of where you can start from Bhakti, you can start from Yoga, you can start from Vedanta, you can start from any other Darshana. You will eventually and inevitably land at the intersection of all of these different streams. It's almost as if all those different streams join an ocean. And you can sit at the banks of this ocean called Indian knowledge systems, take a sip, and develop a movement of wonder. And that's what Ayurveda to me is about. When I sit back and listen to the experts in Ayurveda, and when they talk to me about the rigor in the experimentation, the integrality in the philosophical formulation, and the empathy in the experiment and the idea of medicine as preventive, not just as post-disease cure. All of that shows that this was a very, very mature, very full, very rich knowledge system. And if you're sitting at the banks of this ocean called Indian knowledge systems, then Ayurveda can be the boat that you can take and sail through to the other side and really realize your own potential. So these three areas. One is, why is Ayurveda a necessary and a very compelling ingredient of global epistemic pool? The idea of Ayurveda as self-leadership or as swatantra for you to realize your own potential. And thirdly, the idea of Ayurveda and its criticality in what we're looking at, not just as a nation, but as Bharat contributing to the global futures in the next 25 years. What are the things that we should be thinking about when we look at a rich pool of knowledge like Ayurveda? So those are three areas that I wish to cover, and I hope it's of some value and brings some diversity to the conversations that we are having. I'm sure there's a lot of expertise and technical knowledge and exposition of the concepts of Ayurveda as part of other conversations. My interest particularly is in understanding this as a knowledge system that can be used in public leadership and public policy. So let's take the first element first, the idea of epistemic diversity and why that is critical, and what is the case for Ayurveda, if there is a case for epistemic diversity. Now, we've just come off the entire global experience of having to deal with the pandemic. All of us have gone through the horrors of losing somebody that we know, of lockdowns, of extraordinarily draconian policy making as well. If you think about it from a policy perspective, the kind of imposition that has happened from lockdowns to passports to very, very heavy interventions in personal choices, all of that is well intentioned at a certain level, because you are facing the prospect. If you are a state, if you are a nation, if you are a government, you are facing the prospect of an unknown and a very dangerous entity. And there is obviously a lot of panic around it. No public health crisis is easy to manage, let alone a global one. Even if it were to be concentrated in a small area, it takes tremendous grit, persistence, and leadership to solve these things. So when you're faced with a global crisis like COVID, it was obvious that the entire fraternity came together to look at what can be a plausible solution. We don't need to impute any other intention except, of course, trying to find solutions for a problem that was facing all of us together. But early on, and definitely with the benefit of retrospective understanding now, we could see that there was a monochromatic narrative. We could see that we did not have, as a global commons, enough epistemic or enough pool of knowledge resources to try and approach a complex problem. And this is one of the mental models of complexity thinking itself. In a world that is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, in a world that is deeply integrated as supply chains, as global capital, as labor movements, it's extremely difficult to think about something as one system or one thing that fits all, because it does not really land well. Not all cultures, not all societies are fertile to land just one idea or one thought as a universalist solution. So there was, in my understanding, and it's corroborated now by a lot of research and investigative journalism that's coming around, there was in the panic that surrounded the thinking around COVID, there was definitely a rush to try and fix on one solution as the global policy. And this has come to us as a few narratives. If you think about the narrative of vaccinate the planet, if you think about the narrative of war on COVID, if you think about the narrative after the vaccination process was over and people started moving around, there was this weird notion of revenge travel. Right? These questions and this framing of global policy comes from a certain kind of epistemology. This whole idea of war on COVID is exactly like how global policy frames war on terror, which means that there is a certitude that you identified something as the villain and you mobilize all of your collective resources to try and fight that villain. Right? That's the mental model of the policymaker. Vaccinate the planet. Right? This again is the idea of scale, that you found one solution and the entire world has to be, we need to have operational efficiency to try and administer that one solution to the entire planet of 10 billion people. Now, when you're dealing with a complex phenomenon like COVID, it's always critical in any complex crisis to try and run several distinct small experiments, because we really don't know what we don't know. We have no idea about the actual number of variables that are impacting something that is breaking through, especially if that is something that is live and that is supposed to be emergent and that is, sort of evolving as a response to what you introduce into the system. It means that you have to have the humility. You need to have epistemic humility to run diverse experiments. But to even have the prospect of diverse experiments, you need to first have what we would call access to a knowledge system, because you can only experiment based on something that has evolved as a discipline and has gone through the rigor of exposition, experimentation, refutation, and establishing the Siddhanta. And that is why a variety of knowledge systems are really, really critical. We see this in some of the global policy making when they talk about indigenous knowledge traditions, when they talk about cultural legacies, when they talk about heritage. China, for example, has done a great job. We all know about this in their articulation and their policy position of traditional Chinese medicine and the sort of importance and significance that is given to that. Unfortunately, despite having the richest knowledge tradition and a lived experience of living with nature and as people, as societies together, it is not even a claim for exceptionalism at that point. It is just fact that we have more lived experience, and living together continuously for a longer period of time gives you the ability to experiment more, gives you the ability to understand and seek more, and therefore document better knowledge. The traditions might be different. Somebody might be documenting it in a certain way and call that scientific. Somebody might be passing it on from family to family in an oral culture. But it is undeniable that there is a knowledge inheritance that India has. And it is, I would say, the lack of policy trust and in many cases, the lack of vision that has prevented us from having a seat at that table in the conversation around knowledge and culture. So it is important to understand that while there is this monochromatic urge, there is this rush to frame something in an universalist language and then deploy that as global policy. In many ways, that is also because there is really not been enough effort bringing out the diversity in our knowledge traditions. And I think that is where we first need to locate Ayurveda. And why is this critical in the context of something like COVID? Right? I've already mentioned about the rush to universalize one mode of thinking and frame global policies without any regard for culture, diversity, without any regard for environment. How does something work in a cold country versus a hot country? How does something work in a maritime kind of environment versus, let's say, landlocked? We need a knowledge system that actually increases the range of our observation beyond what we think is immediate. And to me, even in my limited, very, very limited and admittedly outsider in perspective of Ayurveda, I was always amazed by this, by just the sheer complexity and the integration of nature, time, mind into the elements of what we would consider otherwise as medical research or public health. And this just blows my mind, because this is exactly the kind of epistemology that you need if you are to tackle things that are uncertain. You cannot really solve the problems that you've created at a certain level of consciousness by being at the same level of consciousness or at the same level of knowledge. That's what Einstein said, right? So clearly, you need a knowledge system that is able to look at what in Ayurveda we call Janapada, right? I'd spoken to some professors, Malaji had mentioned this to me, that the way to think about COVID from an Ayurvedic perspective, one of the dimensions of inquiry would be Janapadodvamsa. And think about that word. Janapada has so much packed into it. It has your culture, it has your nature, it has your economy, it has your ecology, it has your language, it has time, it has space. So all of these things have been packed together and said, if you want to inquire about a complex phenomenon, think about what's happening at the intersection of all of these things. This inquiry was simply not present if you were to examine any literature around how a solution is being proposed today when something is identified as pandemic. So very, very critical that we talk about Ayurveda as complexity thinking. To me, the mind image that immediately flashes when I think about Ayurveda is how complex and how particular and how close to life it really is. If this system is so complex, your inquiry and your medical system cannot be simplistic. It has to be about prevention. It has to be about the intersection of how I interact with the 5 elements. How do I feel when I actually experience something like a yajna? How do I feel in Ayurveda Chikitsa? I'm told, although I've never had the personal experience, but I've heard from people who've had this and I've read a little bit, that the Chikitsa or the treatment is about actually re-architecting you in a manner that you're closer to your original constitution. This is an extraordinarily powerful thinking paradigm for complexity. That you do not actually try and treat the second order symptoms, but you understand that there is a stable core and your interventions are to restore things back to their original form. In fact, the whole idea of reform, even if you look at in a socio-cultural space, the meaning of the word reform is to bring it back to the original shape. Unfortunately, today, with a linear idea of time, we think about reform only as a progressive plunge into the future without understanding the cyclicality of time, without understanding the cyclicality of your own thought modes, without understanding the cyclicality of your entire ritual universe from day to night to seasons. So we have lost that critical dimension in our knowledge exposition of tying things into nature and trying to get things back to the original constitution. We always think, because in many ways, the impact of colonization is that your idea of time is taken away from you. And that, that manifests in different ways. Culturally, you will see this as the phenomenon of you only live once. If the entire culture, knowledge system, and the larger policy making apparatus is operating on the principle of you only live once, then panic and fear, what we in culture hear it as fear of missing out, is a natural outcome. It is by design that we have more stress today. It is by design that we have more panic today. It is by design that despite being extraordinarily connected like no other time in any other part of history, we are all feeling lonely. It is because our idea of time has been taken away from us as part of the modern industrial colonial enterprise. And Ayurveda, in the committee of knowledge traditions across the world, has the potential to give us back our sense of time. It can give us back our sense of nature. It can give us back the ability to feel that we are one with the Panchabhutas. In fact, we are the Panchabhutas. Right? So this insight, when I first heard about Ayurveda Chikitsa, which includes some remedies. Sometimes they ask you to stand by water and just observe the sound and the flow of the water. Sometimes they ask you to walk barefoot on mud. Sometimes they ask you to look at the sky for 10-15 minutes and develop that sense of vastness inside you to deal with what life throws at you. These are not simplistic. These are not reductionist frameworks at all. These are extraordinary interventions of connecting us back to our source, which is where the entire idea lies. And it blew my mind, honestly, when I first understood or when I first heard that the word chikitsa is actually about searching for the light. Think about that paradigm, that it is saying that surgery is not about removing something alone. It is not that. Or any clinical process is not about trying to fix at the outer realm. It is about making sure that you are back in that position to search for the inner light within you. Even an idea of surgery is about going back to the source. That is the profundity of this philosophy, that it understood that there is that perfect one core, which is the, we can call it Purusha, we can call it Brahman, whatever that source is. That source, and finding that source and getting connected to that source, is the real idea of well-being. It is simultaneously physical, it is social, it is cultural, it is psychological, it is spiritual. Right? It combines all the dimensions of human experiences into one, in one philosophy, and that is what we call swasthya in Ayurveda. The idea of well-being. In fact, Charaka Samhita itself describes arogyam as the ability to pursue purushartha. That if you're able to be in a state where your natural flow is enabling you to pursue dharmartha kama moksha, that is arogya. This backdrop, this ontological backdrop of a philosophy, is entirely missing for us as global humanity in our exposition, in our exploration of solutions for problems that affect all of us. And without this backdrop, without this ability to really, and as a knowledge tradition, connect back to the source that illuminates the entire universe, you're unlikely to find a solution for these emergent complexities. In your rush, in almost your arrogance to impose yourself on nature, you will end up causing more damage if you do not have a knowledge system like this. So for me, the intellectual and moral case for Ayurveda in a public leadership, public policy dimension is that it is one of those very few sources. There might be others that I'm not aware of, but Ayurveda, particularly Ayurveda and yoga together, come to us from this perspective of being one with the nature. Come to us with this idea of incredible diversity in nature, in plants, in animals, in the entire biosphere, and how that can be integrated into your own experience to connect back to that one source which actually illuminates everything else. This will be a more enduring solution than trying to vaccinate the planet, trying to wage a war with everything that's emergent. We might need to do certain things tactically. We will, when I talk about epistemic humility and epistemic diversity, clearly all kinds of new advances in all coming from all medical streams and all kinds of public health interventions are all welcome and critical. But if we do not have the scope to expand the range of our experiments, if we do not have the scope to introduce a new integral philosophy into the conversation about public health, we are running a race against ourselves, and that's not going to end well. We can already see this. We haven't factored the second, third order consequences of what we've done with COVID. The amount of microplastics that we have ingested into environment. I remember, just tons and tons of plastic from the small sachets that we use to the disposable, to some other chemicals that we've used. We haven't thought that the virus and our system, all of us cohabit in this larger thing called nature or environment, however you wish to frame it. And what we release into that, which will actually pollute the Panchabhutas, will actually affect us back. Today, scientific research is telling us that all of our medical interventions in the last 40, 50 years has increased the scope of allergies, has actually brought in newer viruses and newer allergies. And once again, the cycle is vicious, where we will try and introduce, quick fixes and cures to this, which have the impact of generating a negative surplus for nature. So we have to, really reclaim the indigenous knowledge traditions all over the world, particularly something as mature as Ayurveda, if we have to have any chance of sustainably and holistically dealing with the complexity of a global civilization. So my first case for Ayurveda and my first submission, and what I hope to persuade anybody who's listening to this, is that Ayurveda is an indispensable and integral part of the global architecture of knowledge if we are to solve the grand challenges that affect all of us. It could be immigration, it could be loneliness, it could be epidemics, It could be the ideas of war and peace. It could be anything that you take care at a global level. You need a knowledge system that connects you back to the source, which tells you in a lived fashion how to actually experience well-being, not just as a theory or a mental construct, but the combination of all the things and all the dimensions, the cultural, psychological, social, physical, emotional, and spiritual dimensions that make us up. Since Ayurveda touches on all of these things and has the deepest exploration, we have a compelling case to make. The second, and it's integral to what I've already mentioned, is the idea of Ayurveda as a personal praxis. And here we can think about the concept of bala in Ayurveda. Right? I'm told, I'm not an expert on this, but I'm told there are 3 kinds of balas that Ayurveda gives us. And all of it, the real enduring bala is connected to the idea of sattva. Right? To cultivate more and more sattva in your conduct, in your thought, in your imagination. When that happens, you tap into other realms of strength that help you do great things. And this is a deep philosophy. This is a deep personal guidance, because all of us are struggling, trying to balance the incredibly diverse set of demands that modern life puts on us, right? From our work to families to our existential challenges with nature, to the idea of extractive economy, competition, the idea of space, time, individuality. These are all having profound impact on the way we think and connect with each other, and more importantly, how we connect with ourselves. Right? In that context, you need something that tells you that there are deeper reserves within you. There are things that you can tap into through your own sadhana. There are helpful mechanisms if you are able to practice a certain charya. If you're able to bring in a bit of self-discipline into your life, you have the ability and you have the prospect and you have the certitude of tapping into higher strengths, which will help you not just deal with it, but also overcome it and produce something profound for the rest of the world. So this idea of bala, particularly the idea of Atma bala, seems very, very powerful to me. They say there is the sahaja, which is the physical form. Then there are certain temporal forms of bala. Then there is the deeper element of shakti that you build within you. And this is again not given to you just as theory. It is brought to you in very specific ways as the dinacharya and ritucharya. It is brought to you as the idea of understanding your own tridoshas. It is brought to you as understanding what is to be done at a certain time with a certain emotion, with a certain element of nature. Think about this combination. This is the deepest part of our Indian knowledge tradition, that we look at the sacred element in everything and get into a relationship with that sacred. We sacralize space as kshetras. We sacralize time as muhurta. We sacralize life. We sacralize death. We sacralize every single experience that we have as humans. And Ayurveda is imbued with the same idea of the sacred element in nature. It is the Veda Purusha. It is the sum total of all of our consciousness, which is the infinite fount. And Ayurveda gives you very specific steps to try and connect to that source. And this can be experiential. You don't need any other belief, or you don't need to discard neither rationality nor emotion nor faith to understand this. You simply follow the dinacharya. You understand what is the fundamental constitution through the panchabhutas and the panchabhutas that interact with you along with your mind. And you will get to have that anubhuti, the defining characteristic of the Indian epistemology, something that in my mind distinguishes us from the rest of the knowledge traditions, simply because we are a living tradition. We are lucky to have those systems of transmission in temples, in Sanskrit, in Gurukula, that have given us the ability to transfer knowledge and experience and wisdom from one generation to another without having to disrupt. If you compare the knowledge traditions between civilizations, we notice that one knowledge tradition coming to us, let's say from a Western civilization where reason and freedom have sort of taken the place of God, there is there is this characteristic that every new knowledge is a disruption or a disproving of the previous one. It's almost like there is, you're running a relay race without actually handing off. So you're actually running, in circles. You're not moving forward, right? But if you look at the Indian knowledge tradition, because we've understood the importance of institutions, IKS is an institution, it's a knowledge institution, but also the socio-cultural, spiritual, and intellectual traditions of Gurukula, of temples, of Vedangas. The idea to transmit knowledge in its most undiluted form from one generation to another over a long period of time, assimilating all of our experience together and distilling it as Shastras to give you the best compendium of knowledge available to you as a praxis for personal excellence. So all of this talk around leadership, personal leadership, how do you manage yourself? I think Ayurveda has a tremendous role and extraordinary relevance to this very, very important topic of building your own personal leadership through the ideas such as Bala, Atma Bala, and Sattva. So that's my second proposition, that Ayurveda has to make a very, very distinctive and a very compelling contribution, and a very telling one at that, in the area of personal leadership. We have to start articulating leadership using Ayurvedic terms. If you're looking at a person with certain gunas, we have to say that this is the Sattva guna that's speaking to the person. If you're talking about dealing with complexity, we have to say this is the Panchabhutas interacting in a certain way. Whatever the formulation is, it can be a creative synthesis with other knowledge traditions, but without either diluting or without shriveling, Ayurveda has to come to the forefront and say Ayurveda is the leadership manual for you to realize your potential. So I'm very interested in how scholars and practitioners and people outside the knowledge tradition, but very sympathetic and very admiring and reverential of the knowledge tradition, like me and other organizations. How can we come together to create frameworks and vocabulary and practices of personal leadership using Ayurveda? So that's my second proposition. And I'll now move and end with what should we do if we claim a legacy of knowledge, if we say that this knowledge is not just relevant but critical to global futures, to the idea of personal leadership. If you've linked the macro with the micro, the individual with the global, how do we then think about the next 25 years with this time that we're talking about? Firstly, this idea of sacralizing time itself, which is Amrit Kal, which is very Ayurvedic, if you were to think about it, right? Ayurveda treatments have very, very specific prescriptions on what is to be done at a specific time. I'm told that the actual Ayurveda treatment will begin with a Agnihotra. You have to do the fire worship. You have to get into that, and it has to be done at a certain time. Then you need to cleanse your physical constitution through some intervention. So there is a very deep, direct resonance in the vision that the nation is asking all of us to come together on, of India at 2047, and what Ayurveda can do towards that. I think we have to think about positioning Ayurveda in the discourse on global knowledge traditions for global futures. That's the first thing that it's a case that I made in this speech as well. That we should come together and try and think about what is Ayurveda's role in enabling global futures. We have to examine globalization through Ayurveda. We have to examine economic systems through Ayurveda. We have to examine psychological dimensions of intercultural exchanges through Ayurveda. So when we say Ayurveda has to become a conversational element in global futures, it is that every single development, from war to trade to travel to psychology, every single element of human coming together or institutions, nations coming together, Ayurveda must have an opinion. Ayurveda must start producing literature, start commenting on everything through our framework. We have to examine every single policy announcement and say whether this will increase Rajas, whether this will increase Sattva, whether this will increase, what are the personality types that you need? Do you need more Vata in this? Do you need more Kapha? all of that knowledge system, which gives you the samskaras and the ability to practice those samskaras, learn those samskaras, and elevate those samskaras, that is enough. That is enough of a framework to analyze everything in the world. And this is where Ayurveda has to work with other disciplines. We need a very, very rich dialogue and synthesis, firstly within the Indic knowledge traditions, but from a very cross-functional perspective. Ayurveda needs to work with designers, Ayurveda needs to work with technologists, Ayurveda needs to work with artists, Ayurveda needs to work with storytellers, Ayurveda needs to work with policymakers, Ayurveda needs to work with films. All of these things, we have to really cultivate the public cultural consciousness using Ayurvedic philosophy. So my vision in the next 25 years is that when we have debates, we will immediately have an Ayurvedic scholar saying that in this debate, this personality was a demonstration of what happens when something is a prakriti or a vikriti. I don't know the technical language, but I have perfect imagination of how that language can be deployed in discourse analysis, in news presentation, in in articulation of ideas. It has to come into a colloquial public language. So that's one. Secondly, we have to think about Ayurveda as science and more than science together, right? We are always going to have this challenge. We have to be very realistic. We cannot afford to be naive about the politics of international institutions and the geopolitics of nation states and the strategic dimensions of this. That is inevitable, right? Nobody is going to give you a seat just like that. So apart from having an opinion and a very rich dialogue and literature and platforms to express everything about the world in Ayurvedic terms, we also need to start crafting policy initiatives. How do we actually impart Ayurvedic knowledge? How do we build institutions that can use Ayurveda as a fundamental element, right? Ayurveda has to be part of your let's say your IAS training, your civil services training has to be first grounded in Ayurveda, right? Similarly, if you have a international multilateral organization, it has to be about Ayurveda has to have a diagnostic tool there. So we need interventions in very practical applications, but strategic ones, where Ayurveda can become the tool of diagnosis and the language of exchange. And for that, apart from the cross-functional sort of interactions that I mentioned, you also need to have some strategic thinking around areas of intervention. And that, I think, is a leadership challenge within Ayurveda. We need, we made a case for Ayurveda in leadership, but leadership for Ayurveda is something that we should consciously cultivate. So in the next 25 years, my hope and my imagination, my work is also that we create this network, a very rich network, which is able to strategize what future looks for using Ayurveda and for Ayurveda. So that's the second thing. And this will necessarily obviously involve interactions with what is called modern science or the epistemology of modern science. And we need, once you have a strategy, you also understand that you first need to understand that you need to master that language, that thinking, that experimentation to actually write a paper. And we need to have transmission mechanisms for that. And lastly, the spiritual component. All of the crisis that we are talking about it's not different crisis. At the root of our challenge today in the world is the fact, and Daniel Smartenberger expresses it beautifully. He says that we are approaching the power of gods without the wisdom of gods. And that is something for us to think about. That we are heading into a spiritual void. At the heart of this movement of collective panic, movement of collective meaninglessness, movement of nihilism, that we're going through and that is being pushed down on our throats, that life is meaningless, everything is fluid. Ayurveda has to intervene at a social level. It is way too important to be left just in academia or even in just some elite interactions. Ayurveda is a science of the people. Ayurveda is a tool of the people. Ayurveda is a inheritance of the communities. So the social dimension of this, which is the only way to fight this battle against meaninglessness, this community coming together, Ayurveda has to be Ayurveda has to have a vision of how it builds communities together. And one of the first insights that I had about Indic knowledge systems that was a profound moment of transformation for me is when I heard from Paturi ji, Nagaraj Paturi sir, that the Indian knowledge system had a fundamental recognition or an insight that nature needs biodiversity. Nature creates variety for herself, to experiment with different things and evolve new forms of life. Nature is perpetually creating. She is perpetually trying to create new, but there is stability in that. There is the Purusha and Prakriti. The creative aspect of that is never without the stable core. But there are such incredibly diverse forms of creation happening all the time. But to protect that diversity, we need cultural diversity. The moral case for cultural diversity, as opposed to one metaphysics, one life metaphysics, universalist metaphysics, without a praxis, is that small community in a remote part of India protecting one herb or protecting one tree or sacralizing one grove is actually contributing to the fundamental aspect of providing diversity for nature to create new forms of life. And that is the only way life is sustained for all of us. When water, those plants, those animals, all of that diversity that nature needs is protected. And that is the job of culture. So there is biodiversity that nature needs. There is cultural diversity that we have to create to protect that. And that is why we are inherently comfortable with diversity. It is a lived experience. Languages, the outer elements of your clothing, food, yes, they're all markers of diversity. But the deeper aspect of diversity is that we understand in a lived way that there is interdependence amongst us. We have to come together as different communities protecting different parts of our sacred universe. And that is the spirit in which unity can be built. Unity is not a moral construct. Unity is not a political construct. Unity is a natural construct. Interdependence amongst communities is only experienced when you actually have that spiritual vision of life. So my final call for Ayurveda is that it should bring back that beauty of spiritual experience to all of us, so that in a social way we can come together, and the narratives of division that are used to really destabilize India, we have a knowledge system response to that as well. We can show people in their lived experience that you protecting one part of nature, another community protecting another part of it, all of it coming together in a beautiful, cohesive fashion to produce health and well-being and joy is the real purpose of any knowledge. So I leave it at that. Three cases of why Ayurveda is critical at a global level, why Ayurveda is critical at a personal level, and why Ayurveda is the knowledge system of the future. I thank everyone involved in this initiative for this wonderful idea and just the intent to bring out the beauty of Ayurveda. And I'm very, very grateful to have this opportunity to talk to all of you as part of this. Thank you. Namaste. Jai Hind.